A mark of fate. It was an ordinary afternoon in a small town nestled between the hills and the highway, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower. The streets were lined with old brick buildings, their facades worn with age, but carrying a certain charm. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from the local bakery, mingling with the distant laughter of children playing near the town square. Alexander Hayes, one of the most influential billionaires in the country, was there on business, though the town itself held little significance to him. He had arrived in his sleek black limousine, stepping out onto the cobblestone street with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to power. His tailored suit, a deep charcoal gray, contrasted sharply with the town's casual, easygoing atmosphere. To him, this was just another routine stop, a small land deal to be finalized, a mere blip in his whirl of high-stakes negotiations. He stood near an ornate fountain in the center of the square, engrossed in the glowing screen of his phone, his mind occupied with figures and contracts. The world around him faded as he read through financial projections, his lips pressing into a thin line of concentration. Then, something unexpected happened. A small hand tugged at the sleeve of his jacket. "Excuse me, sir," a tiny voice said, soft but confident. Startled, Alexander glanced down. A little girl, no older than 7, stood before him. Her dark brown hair was pulled into 2 messy braids, and her bright, curious eyes peered up at him. She clutched a well-worn stuffed rabbit in one hand, its fabric frayed from years of love and companionship. Yes, his voice was measured, businesslike. He wasn't used to being approached so casually, especially by a child. The girl grinned, revealing the gap where her 2 front teeth should have been. "My grandma has a birthmark just like yours," she said, pointing at his wrist. Alexander's breath hitched. His pulse quickened. His right wrist, the one she was referring to, bore a dark, oddly shaped mark. It had been there since birth, an inconsequential thing that he rarely thought about. It had never meant anything to him, until now. "What?" He frowned slightly, lowering his arm. "What do you mean?" The girl pointed to the same spot on her own wrist. "Right here," she said cheerfully. "She always says it's special." Alexander felt a strange sensation in his chest, something he couldn't quite place. He had always known he was adopted, but he had never sought out his birth family. His past was something he had chosen to leave untouched. It had no bearing on his present, or so he had always told himself. But now this small, seemingly insignificant conversation with a child had struck something deep inside him. "Your grandmother," his voice came out quieter than he expected. "She has a mark like this." "Yep." The girl nodded enthusiastically. "Wanna meet her?" Alexander hesitated. A part of him, a deeply buried part, felt an inexplicable pull toward this child and the woman she spoke of. But another part, the one that thrived on control and logic, screamed at him to walk away. "I don't know," he started, but the girl was already taking his hand. "Come on," she said, tugging him toward a park bench across the square. He let her lead him. His legs felt heavier with every step, as if he were approaching something that would change his life in ways he wasn't prepared for. Sitting on the bench was an elderly woman with soft gray hair, neatly tied in a low bun. She wore a modest dress, and her warm brown eyes crinkled with a quiet wisdom. She was feeding pigeons, breaking small pieces of bread and scattering them with delicate fingers. She looked up just as they reached her. The moment their eyes met, Alexander felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Her gaze lingered on his face, searching, recognizing, as if she had seen a ghost from a long-forgotten past. Her expression was unreadable at first, but then it softened, and something flickered in her eyes, something that looked like understanding, something that looked like pain. "Grandma, look," the little girl beamed. "He has a birthmark just like yours." The old woman's eyes flickered down to Alexander's wrist. Her breath hitched. For a moment, she simply stared, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. Then, In a voice barely above a whisper, she said the words that would forever change his life. It can't be. Alexander's world tilted on its axis. The logical part of his brain fought to rationalize what was happening. But his heart was hammering against his ribs in a way that defied all reason. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely steady. The woman swallowed hard, as if bracing herself against a tidal wave of emotions. She lifted her wrist slowly, hesitantly, and turned it over. The birthmark was there, identical to his. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. Everything around him, the fountain, the pigeons, the gentle chatter of the townspeople, faded into the background. All that remained was the undeniable connection between himself and the woman before him. She looked up at him again, her eyes glistening with something dangerously close to tears. "I had a son once," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He was taken from me, before I ever had the chance to hold him." The words cut through Alexander like a blade. His entire life, he had never sought answers about his past. He had never cared to. But in this moment, standing before this woman with the same birthmark on her wrist, he realized something terrifying. The past had finally caught up with him, and it would not be ignored. A past unraveled. Alexander Hayes sat frozen, his world narrowing to the elderly woman before him. The town square, the laughter of children, the whispering breeze, everything had faded into insignificance. The birthmark on her wrist was identical to his. Not similar, not a coincidence, identical. His mind raced, struggling to rationalize what was happening. He had never believed in fate, in destiny, in unseen threads connecting people's lives. He was a man of control, of calculated decisions, of numbers that always had to add up. But at this moment, nothing in his life made sense. The elderly woman's eyes never left his, studying his face like she was seeing something she had long lost. Her hands trembled slightly. And for a moment, Alexander saw past the lines on her face, past the weight of years she had carried. There was recognition in her eyes. "Sir," the little girl, Emma, she had said her name looked between the two of them, confused. "Are you okay?" Alexander finally forced himself to breathe. He had faced some of the toughest boardrooms, outmaneuvered some of the most cunning businessmen, and yet right now, in front of an old woman and a 7-year-old girl, he felt completely unprepared. He cleared his throat, but his voice still came out strained. Who are you?" The woman exhaled shakily, her fingers tightening around the piece of bread she had been feeding to the pigeons. "My name is Margaret," she said softly. "And I think—" She hesitated, looking at him as if saying the next words might shatter her. "I think you might be the son I lost." The words hit Alexander like a punch to the chest. "No," he muttered instinctively, shaking his head. "That's not possible. I was adopted. Margaret gave a sad, knowing smile. "I know." Her voice was calm, but her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "I was young. I had no family, no one to turn to. The decision wasn't mine." She swallowed hard. "They took you from me the moment you were born." The weight of her words pressed down on him. A part of him wanted to deny it, to walk away and call this nothing more than a misunderstanding. But another part, the part that had always lived in the back of his mind, wondering why his birth parents had never come looking for him, couldn't ignore the possibility. Alexander forced himself to look at her again, really look. The shape of her eyes, the way she pressed her lips together when she hesitated, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the raw emotion in her voice. He felt like he was looking in a mirror. His throat tightened. "You're saying I was taken from you?" Margaret nodded, her hands still trembling. Emma, unaware of the emotional storm brewing, climbed onto the bench next to Margaret. "Grandma always tells me about him," she said brightly. "She says she never stopped thinking about him, even though he was gone." Alexander felt like he couldn't breathe. The past was something he had buried deep beneath his success. He had never cared about his biological parents. At least, that's what he had always told himself. But now, confronted with this woman, this possible truth, everything he thought he knew was unraveling. He swallowed hard. I need to think. Margaret's face fell slightly, but she nodded in understanding. Of course, I don't expect you to believe me right away. I don't expect anything from you, Alexander. But if you have questions, I'll answer them. His name on her lips felt strange, like it belonged to a different version of himself. He stood abruptly, needing distance. I have to go. Margaret's lips parted slightly, but she didn't stop him. Emma, however, frowned. Wait. She jumped up, running after him as he turned to leave. You're not coming back. Alexander hesitated. The little girl looked up at him with those big, expectant eyes. Grandma's been waiting for a long time. You can't just leave. His chest tightened. He had every reason to walk away. He didn't need this. He had a life. A successful, powerful life. He had built himself from nothing. And he didn't need to go searching for ghosts of a past that never belonged to him. But something in Emma's face made him pause. I just need time, he said finally, voice softer than he intended. Emma crossed her arms in a way that reminded him of a miniature business negotiator. Promise you'll come back. Alexander hesitated, then, against his better judgment, nodded. I promise. Emma grinned, satisfied, before running back to Margaret. Margaret didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes said enough. Alexander turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. The weight of truth. Alexander returned to his city penthouse, but the usual comfort of his luxurious home felt hollow. He had built his life on control, on never letting emotions dictate his actions. But now, for the first time in years, he felt completely lost. His birth mother. The words felt foreign, unreal. Could it really be true? Could that woman, Margaret, be the one who had given him life? His logical mind told him it was absurd, that he needed proof. And so he called the one person who could get it. Mr. Hayes, the voice on the other end, answered immediately. I need you to run a background check, Alexander said, pacing. On a woman named Margaret Reynolds. Cross-check any adoption records from 35 years ago. His investigator didn't ask questions. He never did. I'll have something for you in a few days. Alexander ended the call and exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. His past was something he had never dared to confront. But now it was confronting him, and there was no running from it. Days of doubt. The report arrived 3 days later. Alexander sat at his desk, staring at the thick folder. He hesitated. Did he even want to know? After a long moment, he flipped it open. The information was cold, clinical, just facts on paper. But the truth was undeniable. Margaret Reynolds had given birth to a baby boy in a state-run hospital 35 years ago. The baby was taken immediately, placed for adoption. The records had been sealed. Until now. Alexander stared at his own name listed in the adoption file. His chest felt tight. She hadn't lied. She hadn't given him up. She had never even been given a choice. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his hands clenched into fists. His entire life, he had believed he was unwanted. But he had never been unwanted. He had been stolen. The realization shook him. Margaret had spent decades wondering about him, searching for him. And all this time, he had been living a life built on half-truths. He stood abruptly, grabbing his keys. There was only one place he needed to be. Back to where it began. The drive back to the small town felt different this time. There was no more doubt, no more denial. When he arrived, Margaret was on the porch, sipping tea. She looked up as he stepped out of the car. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Alexander didn't hesitate. He walked up the steps, standing before her. I know the truth now, he said simply. Margaret's hands trembled around her teacup. And she whispered. Alexander took a deep breath. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to be someone's son. But Margaret's eyes filled with tears. But maybe we can figure it out, he finished. Margaret exhaled shakily, nodding. I'd like that. Emma peeked out from behind the door, grinning. Told you he'd come back. Alexander let out a breath, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Rebuilding bridges. The weight of the truth settled heavily on Alexander's shoulders as he stood on Margaret's porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the worn wooden planks. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation. There were no contracts to sign, no leverage to exploit, just a lifetime of unanswered questions, and a woman who had waited far too long for this moment. Margaret set her tea down carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she gestured for him to sit. Alexander hesitated before lowering himself onto the old wooden bench beside her. The familiarity of the moment startled him, like this was something he had done before in another lifetime, in another world. Emma stood at the doorway, her eyes dancing with excitement. Are you staying for dinner? She asked, practically bouncing on her toes. Alexander turned to Margaret, who gave a small, hesitant smile. Would you? She asked softly. He exhaled slowly. He had every reason to leave. Every instinct told him that getting too close, letting himself feel, was a mistake. But for the first time in his life, walking away didn't feel like the right answer. Yes, he said at last. Emma whooped in victory before running into the house, her laughter trailing behind her. Margaret chuckled under her breath, shaking her head as she turned back to Alexander. She's a handful, she said warmly, but she's the best thing that ever happened to me. Alexander nodded, watching as Emma disappeared into the kitchen. She reminds me of someone. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Oh. Alexander smirked faintly. Myself. Margaret laughed softly. Then I pity the poor woman who has to keep up with you. His smirk faded slightly as he looked down at his hands, his thumb brushing against his wrist, where the birthmark still stood as undeniable proof of their connection. I have questions, he admitted. Margaret's smile faded into something more serious. I'll answer whatever I can. Alexander took a breath, organizing his thoughts before speaking. You said I was taken from you. What happened? Margaret's face grew distant, as if she were staring at something far beyond the horizon. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but each word carried a weight that threatened to crush her. I was 17, she began. Young, scared, alone. Alexander remained silent, his chest tightening at her words. My parents were strict, she continued, the word barely containing the emotions behind it. They didn't believe in mistakes, and to them, having a child out of wedlock was the greatest sin a girl could commit. Alexander frowned. So they forced you to give me up. Margaret let out a hollow chuckle. Forced. That would imply I had a choice. She shook her head. They sent me away to a maternity home the moment they found out. A place for girls like me to have their children in secrecy before the babies were taken away and given to better families. Alexander's grip on his knees tightened. And you never saw me. Not even once. Margaret's breath hitched, and she turned her face away. They never let me hold you, she whispered. I begged. I pleaded. But the moment you were born, they took you from me. I don't even know if you cried. I don't even know if I got to look at you. She wiped at her eyes quickly, as if she was ashamed of the tears. And then I was sent back home, as if nothing had happened. Alexander's jaw tightened. He had spent his entire life assuming his birth mother had willingly abandoned him, that she had decided he wasn't worth keeping. But the reality was far different. She hadn't left him. He had been stolen from her. The weight of that revelation made his stomach churn. I thought about you every day, Margaret continued. Every single day. I searched. I tried to find out where they had taken you, who had adopted you, but the records were sealed. No matter how hard I tried, I could never get close. Alexander clenched his jaw. And my adoptive parents, they never knew. Margaret shook her head. I doubt it. Most adoptive families were never told the full truth. They were just told that the baby needed a loving home. Alexander exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. So all this time, I thought you didn't want me. Margaret's face twisted with heartbreak. Oh, sweetheart, she murmured, reaching out instinctively before stopping herself, unsure if he would accept the contact. He didn't move away. I wanted you more than anything, she whispered. I still do. The words hit him like a tidal wave, sweeping away decades of assumptions and leaving behind a raw, open wound that he wasn't sure how to heal. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret let out a small, shaky laugh. And here I am, spilling my heart out when you just came for dinner. Alexander let out a breath of something close to a chuckle. It's a lot. Margaret nodded. It is. She paused. But I meant what I said before. I don't expect anything from you, Alexander. I don't want to disrupt your life. I just want you to know that I never stopped loving you. Alexander swallowed hard. Love. It was such a foreign concept to him. His adoptive parents had been good people, but they were distant, focused on status and appearances. Affection had been something reserved for special occasions, not everyday life. And yet, this woman, this stranger who had been absent from his life for 35 years, said she had never stopped loving him. Could that be true? Could he even begin to believe it? Before he could speak, Emma's voice called from inside. Dinner's ready. Margaret chuckled, wiping her eyes quickly before standing. Come on, she said, glancing down at him. Stay for just a little while. Alexander hesitated, but the warmth in her voice, the sheer hope in her expression, made it impossible to say no. A step into the unknown. The drive to Margaret's house felt different this time. It wasn't just curiosity pulling him back. It was something deeper. When he arrived, Emma was outside playing in the yard. The moment she saw him, her face lit up. Alexander, she ran up to him, throwing her arms around his waist. I knew you'd come back. He smiled, ruffling her hair. You did, huh? She nodded confidently. Yup. Grandma said you just needed time. But I told her you'd come back sooner than she thought. Margaret appeared at the door then, her expression a mixture of surprise and relief. Alexander. He cleared his throat. I thought we could talk. Margaret smiled warmly. Of course. Come in. As he stepped inside, the familiar scent of home-cooked meals filled the air. It was strange how quickly he had come to associate this place with something safe. They sat at the kitchen table, just as they had the last time. Margaret folded her hands, studying him carefully. What's on your mind? Alexander let out a breath. I need to know everything. Margaret's expression softened. All right. Ask me anything. He hesitated, then finally voiced the question that had been gnawing at him. Did you ever hate them? He asked quietly. Margaret blinked. Who? The people who took me from you. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Your parents, the adoption agency, everyone who made that decision for you. Margaret looked down at her hands, her expression thoughtful. For a long time I did. Alexander's jaw tightened. But hate, it eats at you, she continued. It takes more than it gives, and I didn't want to spend my life being bitter. She met his gaze, so I chose to keep loving you instead. Something inside him cracked. How? He asked, almost desperate. How did you not let it destroy you? Margaret reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. Because I always believed, deep down, that you were out there. That you were okay. That maybe, just maybe, you'd find your way back. His throat tightened. All these years, he had told himself that his past didn't matter. But hearing those words, knowing that someone had been waiting for him, believing in him, made it impossible to ignore. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice rough. "I don't know how to be anyone's son." Margaret smiled, squeezing his hand. "And I don't know how to be your mother. But we have time to figure it out." He swallowed hard. For the first time, the idea didn't seem so impossible. The road ahead. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Alexander found himself watching Margaret and Emma as they laughed and talked. The warmth in the room was something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. When the meal was over, Emma tugged on his sleeve. "Can we watch a movie?" He hesitated. "I should probably get going." Emma pouted. "Please, just one." Margaret chuckled. "You don't have to stay if you don't want to, Alexander." He glanced between them. For the first time in years, he wasn't rushing to leave. "All right," he said finally. "One movie." Emma cheered, dragging him to the couch. Margaret smiled softly as she sat beside them. As the opening credits rolled, Alexander felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just a visit. This wasn't just curiosity. This was the start of something real. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of it. Embracing the unknown. The living room was cozy, bathed in the soft glow of an old lamp in the corner. A knitted blanket was draped over the back of the couch, and the faint scent of cinnamon lingered in the air. It was the kind of space that felt lived in, warm, and welcoming. So different from the sleek, sterile environment of Alexander's penthouse. Emma sat between him and Margaret, a bowl of popcorn balanced in her lap as the movie played. It was an old animated film, the kind he remembered vaguely from his childhood, though he had never paid much attention to such things before. He had always been too busy, too focused on growing up quickly, on proving himself in a world that rewarded success and not sentimentality. But here, in this moment, he wasn't Alexander Hayes, the billionaire. He wasn't the corporate mastermind who controlled boardrooms and dictated the fate of companies. He was just a man sitting with his family, a word he was still learning how to define. Halfway through the movie, Emma yawned and leaned against him, her small head resting against his arm. He stiffened at first, unfamiliar with the feeling of someone trusting him so openly. But after a moment, he relaxed, letting her stay. Margaret glanced at them with a soft smile, her eyes filled with something unreadable. "You know," she murmured, careful not to wake Emma, "you remind me so much of him." Alexander turned to her. "Him." Margaret hesitated, then sighed. "Your father." The words hit him harder than he expected. "My father," he echoed, as if testing how it sounded. Margaret nodded. "I never got the chance to tell you about him." Alexander sat up slightly. "What was he like?" Margaret's gaze drifted toward the window, as if she could see the past through the glass. "He was stubborn," she said with a small chuckle. "Determined. Always had to have the last word in an argument." Alexander smirked. "Sounds familiar." Margaret gave him a knowing look. "It should." The amusement faded from her face as her expression turned more somber. "He never knew about you." Alexander frowned. "What?" Margaret swallowed, her voice quieter now. "I never got the chance to tell him. My parents, they wouldn't let me. They sent me away before I could." A sharp pang shot through Alexander's chest. "So he never even knew I existed." Margaret shook her head. "No, and I think about that every day. About what could have been if things had been different." Alexander exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had spent his life believing he was unwanted, abandoned. Now he was finding out he had a father who never even got the chance to make that choice. "Do you know where he is now?" he asked. Margaret hesitated, then gave a sad smile. "I wish I did." For some reason, the thought unsettled him more than he expected. He had always told himself he didn't care about his biological family. But now, faced with the gaps in his history, he found himself wanting to know. "Do you want to find him?" Margaret asked softly. Alexander didn't answer right away. Did he? For so long, he had defined himself by what he had built. His success had been his foundation, his identity. But now, There were cracks in that identity, pieces missing that he wasn't sure how to fit together. Maybe, he admitted. I don't know. Margaret nodded in understanding. You don't have to decide right now. Alexander sighed, glancing down at Emma, who had now fully curled up against him, fast asleep. You know, I don't think I've ever had a moment like this before, he admitted. Margaret tilted her head. Like what? He gestured slightly. This. Just sitting with family. Feeling like I belong somewhere. Margaret's smile was warm but sad. You always belonged somewhere, Alexander. You just didn't know where to look. The words settled deep inside him, sinking into the parts of himself he had long ignored. He looked around the room, at the little details, the family photos on the wall, the knitted blankets, the worn furniture. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't power. But it felt real. And maybe, for the first time in his life, that was enough. Margaret reached over, placing a gentle hand over his. Whatever happens next, you don't have to go through it alone. Alexander met her gaze. For years, he had been alone, not because he had to be, but because he had chosen to be. Maybe it was time for that to change. I'll come back, he said finally. Margaret's smile widened. I'd like that. As the credits rolled and the house grew quiet, Alexander sat there, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. A call from the past. The next morning, Alexander sat in his penthouse, staring at a name on his phone screen. His private investigator had sent him a message. I found something on your father. Call me when you're ready. His chest tightened. Was he ready? He wasn't sure. But for the first time in his life, he wanted to find out. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the call button. The past wasn't done with him yet. The ghost of a father. Alexander sat in his penthouse, the city stretching endlessly below him. The sleek, modern design of his home suddenly felt cold, sterile. He had always prided himself on the walls he had built, both literal and emotional. But now, those walls felt suffocating. The phone in his hand buzzed again. I found something on your father. Call me when you're ready. He stared at the message from his private investigator. The name, the past, everything he had convinced himself didn't matter, was now right in front of him. All he had to do was press one button. And yet, he hesitated. For the first time in his life, Alexander Hayes, a man who had built empires and negotiated billion-dollar deals, was afraid. What if his father had never wanted him? What if the truth wasn't what he hoped for? What if? He exhaled sharply. Enough. He pressed the call button. The line rang once, twice. Then, a familiar voice picked up. Mr. Hayes, his investigator greeted smoothly. I take it you're ready to hear what I found. Alexander leaned back against the couch, forcing himself to remain calm. Tell me. There was a pause. Then, your father's name was David Callahan. The name meant nothing to him. A stranger. Just another name among millions. But then, his investigator continued. He was a soldier, U.S. Marine Corps, served in multiple tours overseas, honorably discharged after an injury. He was reported missing for a short period before returning home. His records were hard to trace after that. He moved frequently, never staying in one place for too long. It seems he struggled with reintegration after his service. Alexander frowned. You're saying he was homeless? Not exactly, the investigator said carefully. But close. He lived on the outskirts of towns, sometimes taking odd jobs, sometimes disappearing for months. No stable address, no family on record. Just wandering. Alexander's fingers curled into a fist. A man without a home. A man without an anchor. A man who sounded far too much like himself. Is he still alive? Alexander asked, his voice quieter than before. The investigator hesitated. I believe so. I tracked him to a small town in Montana. He goes by the name David Callahan, but no one really knows much about him. He keeps to himself." Alexander let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His father was alive. 35 years. 35 years apart. And now his father was just a plane ride away. "Send me the details," Alexander said, his decision made. "Are you sure you want to do this?" The investigator asked. "You don't know what you're going to find." Alexander's jaw tightened. "I've spent my whole life not knowing. It's time to change that." A journey into the unknown. The flight to Montana was quiet, but Alexander's mind was loud. He replayed every conversation with Margaret. Every moment he had spent believing he was unwanted, abandoned. Every time he had told himself that his past didn't matter. Now it did. Now it was everything. As his private jet touched down at the small regional airport, he felt an unfamiliar sense of unease. He was a man used to control. He dictated the terms of his life. But this was uncharted territory. A black SUV was waiting for him when he landed. The driver handed him an envelope. Inside were the last known whereabouts of David Callahan. A diner. Of all places, his father had been last seen at a diner. Alexander clenched his jaw and stepped into the car. The drive was long, stretching through quiet, open landscapes. There were no skyscrapers, no bustling financial districts, just rolling hills and roads that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. It was a world completely different from his own. And then he saw it. A small roadside diner, its neon sign flickering in the fading evening light. It was the kind of place truckers stopped at, where the coffee was always fresh and the people always knew each other's names. Alexander stepped out of the SUV, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket out of habit. He didn't belong here, and he knew it. But that didn't matter. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door, face to face with the past. The bell above the door jingled as Alexander stepped inside. The scent of frying bacon and coffee filled the air. A few patrons sat scattered at tables, their conversations low and murmured. And then he saw him. A man sat at the farthest booth alone. His hair was graying at the temples, his face weathered with age. He wore a worn-out jacket, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug. His posture was relaxed, but there was something guarded about him, like a man who had spent years expecting the world to take more from him than it gave. David Callahan. Alexander's breath caught. He had expected. What? A businessman. A ghost? Someone who looked like him. But this man, this stranger, this was his father. He took a step forward, his throat dry. And then, as if sensing him, David looked up. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, David frowned slightly, tilting his head. "You lost, son." Alexander almost laughed. Of course, his father wouldn't recognize him. But instead, he pulled out the chair across from David and sat down. "No," Alexander said quietly. "I found exactly what I was looking for." David's gaze sharpened, his fingers tightening around the coffee mug. "You don't look like you're from around here," David said cautiously. "What do you want?" Alexander exhaled. He could say a million things. He could ask 1,000 questions. But in the end, there was only one that mattered. "Did you know Margaret Reynolds?" David's entire body went still. The air between them grew heavy. Slowly, David set down his coffee, his jaw tightening. His eyes, so much like Alexander's, studied him carefully. "Who are you?" David's voice was rough, almost hoarse. Alexander swallowed. "My name is Alexander Hayes." David didn't blink, didn't move. And then, after a long moment, his voice came out barely above a whisper. "Margaret's son." Alexander nodded. David closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling sharply. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them over his face. When he looked up again, his eyes were raw with emotion. "I never knew," David said, his voice cracking. "I never knew she was pregnant." Alexander clenched his fists. "She wanted to tell you. but they took me before she could. David's face twisted with something between regret and pain. All these years, I never even knew I had a son. Alexander's chest tightened. He had spent so long believing he had been unwanted, but maybe, just maybe, that had never been true. David looked at him again, truly looked at him, and for the first time, Alexander saw something in his father's eyes that shook him to his core. Recognition, and maybe even more than that. Hope, the beginning of something new. They sat in that diner for hours, unraveling the past one piece at a time. The answers weren't easy. The pain wasn't simple. But for the first time in his life, Alexander wasn't running from it. He had spent 35 years searching for something he couldn't name. And now, sitting across from his father, he realized he had finally found it. Not closure, not forgiveness, but something better. A second chance, a future rewritten. The small diner felt impossibly quiet as Alexander and David sat across from each other. The hum of conversation from the other patrons faded into the background. The coffee in David's mug had gone cold. The tension between them was thick. Two men, strangers by fate, yet bound by blood, trying to find footing on unfamiliar ground. Alexander had expected many things before coming here: anger, resentment, maybe even denial. But he hadn't expected silence. For the past hour, David had listened, barely speaking. His expression remained unreadable as Alexander recounted what Margaret had told him. The stolen past, the secrets, the truth that had been hidden from them both. And now here they were. David finally exhaled, rubbing his face. When he looked up, his blue-gray eyes, so much like Alexander's, were clouded with something raw. "I never knew," he said again, his voice thick. "I never knew she was pregnant." Alexander had heard those words before, but this time, they carried weight. David Callahan wasn't lying. There was no guilt in his eyes, no attempt to justify himself, just a quiet, painful truth, one that neither of them could change. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. "If you had known, would you have stayed?" David's eyes flashed with something sharp. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I would have stayed. I would have fought for you. For her." The conviction in his voice sent a shiver down Alexander's spine. David shook his head, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Margaret, she meant everything to me. If I had known." He cut himself off, exhaling sharply. "But I didn't, and by the time I came back, she was gone." Alexander frowned. "Came back." David sighed, looking down at his hands. "When I left for my last tour, Margaret and I weren't just together. We were planning a life. I was going to marry her when I got back." His voice wavered. "But that last mission, it changed everything." Alexander remained silent, waiting. David's fingers drummed against the table before he continued. "There was an ambush. Half my unit didn't make it out. I was injured, badly. Spent months in a hospital overseas. By the time I was stable enough to come back." He let out a bitter chuckle. "Everything was gone. My career, my sense of purpose. And Margaret, she had vanished." Alexander clenched his jaw. "Because her parents sent her away." David nodded, his lips pressed into a tight line. "I searched for her, for years, but by then, she was a ghost. I had no idea she had been pregnant. No idea I had a son." The weight of those words settled heavily in Alexander's chest. All his life, he had thought his father had left him. But the truth was worse. His father had been robbed of the chance to know him, just like Margaret had. Alexander exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Why didn't you rebuild? Why not try to start over?" David gave a humorless smile. "I tried." He gestured around the diner. "But some wounds don't heal right. Some people, they don't get second chances." Alexander studied the man before him. There was no self-pity in David's voice, just acceptance, the resignation of a man who had learned to live with ghosts. For the first time, Alexander saw himself reflected in someone else. A man who had spent his life searching for something he couldn't name. A man who had built walls so high that he had forgotten how to let people in. But unlike David, Alexander still had a choice. Breaking the cycle. The silence stretched between them. Finally, David exhaled. "Why did you come looking for me?" Alexander hesitated. He had asked himself the same question on the plane ride here. For so long, he had believed that family didn't matter, that he was fine on his own, that the past was just that, the past. But then he met Margaret, and Emma, and now David. And suddenly, the things he had spent his whole life ignoring had become the only things that mattered. "I don't know," he admitted. I just needed to know." David nodded slowly, as if he understood. "And now that you do." Alexander exhaled. "Now, I have to figure out what comes next." David leaned back, studying him. "Do you want me to be a part of it?" The question caught Alexander off guard. Did he? This was a man he had never known. A man who had lived an entirely separate life. But he was also his father. And Alexander had spent too long running from the truth to turn back now. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I do." David's lips pressed together. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Then let's figure it out." Returning home, Alexander's flight back felt different. He had come here seeking answers. He had found them. But instead of closure, he had found something else. Something unfinished. Something worth exploring. By the time he landed, his phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. "Emma keeps asking when you're coming back. Hope you're doing okay. No pressure, just thinking of you." Alexander stared at the message for a long time. Then, without hesitation, he replied, "I'll be there soon." He had spent his whole life believing that family was something distant, something irrelevant. But maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. The first step. When Alexander pulled up to Margaret's house, Emma was already waiting. She ran to him the moment he stepped out of the car, throwing her arms around his waist. "You're back." Alexander smiled, ruffling her hair. "Told you I would be." Margaret stood at the door, her eyes filled with quiet relief. "How did it go?" Alexander took a deep breath. "There's a lot to unpack," he admitted. "But I met him." Margaret's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "And?" Alexander hesitated. Then, for the first time in a long time, he spoke the truth. "I think I'd want to try." Margaret smiled softly, stepping aside. "Then you're in the right place." As he stepped inside, Emma grabbed his hand, tugging him toward the couch. "Grandma made cookies, and you're staying for dinner, right?" Alexander smirked. "I suppose I don't have a choice." Margaret chuckled. "Not with her. You don't." Alexander glanced around the house. The warmth, the simplicity, the feeling of home. For the first time in his life, he wasn't searching for something more. He had found exactly what he needed. A second chance. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. Epilogue. A future rewritten. Months later, Alexander sat in the same kitchen he had once hesitated to enter. Across from him, Margaret smiled as she sipped her tea. Emma sat beside him, drawing something in her notebook. And next to her, David, his father. Not a stranger anymore. Just family. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't simple. But it was real. And for Alexander Hayes, a man who had spent his life believing he had no past, no roots, that was enough. It was more than enough.